Hello everyone. Today we will have another topic to discuss, which is all about the hypothesis. So what does a hypothesis mean? So let us define what is a hypothesis. The word hypothesis comes from the two Greek words hypo, which means under, and titheni, which means to place. It is a premise or claim that we want to test. A hypothesis is defined as a proposition placed under examination, which cannot be accepted as true unless proven and tested statistically. That's why there are statistical tools that we need to study or we need to use to treat our data when we conduct researches or study. And out of these statistical tools, we can now prove, or yes, we can now prove or find an answer out of our hypothesis. So there are two kinds of hypothesis. We have the null hypothesis, wherein we denote the null hypothesis as HO, or sometimes we read as H naught, NAUGHT, wherein not is an old-fashioned word for zero. Pero the general term for null hypothesis is, we read it as HO. So the null hypothesis, so this expresses the idea of no existence of relationship. So there is no existence of relationship or difference between the variables under study. It implies neutrality and objectivity. So neutral lang tayo when we talk about null hypothesis. Always remember that for null hypothesis, there is no existence of relationship or differences between the variables that you want to treat. Let's have an example. So, first example, there is no. So, as you can see, the three examples here, the first three words that is used out of the null hypothesis is there is no. So, which means there is no um, relationship or differences out of the variable. So there's, for example, there is no significant difference between the mathematical achievement of technology students and hotel and industry management students. The second one is there is no significant relationship between the attitude of students towards their subjects and their performance rating at the end of the semester. So, walang connection. Parang yung sinasabi niya na walang connection or relationship. And the last one is there's no significant difference between the competencies of nurses from government hospitals and private hospitals. So that is an example. So these are examples of the null hypothesis or the HO. The second kind of hypothesis is we have the alternative hypothesis, or we call it as HA, or sometimes we call it as research hypothesis. So this is the opposite of the null hypothesis. It states the existence of difference or a relationship. If the null hypothesis, it states that there is no relationship, hindi nag-exist ang relationship or difference between the variables. For the alternative hypothesis, merong existence. Okay? There is an existence between the relationship or differences of the variables. So it is the hypothesis that the researcher tries to establish. So ito yung parang gusto niyang i-prove, the alternative hypothesis. So the example Example of alternative hypothesis, there is a significant difference between the mathematical achievement of technology students and hotel and industry management students, or there is a significant relationship between the attitude of students towards their subject and their performance rating at the end of the semester, or there is a significant difference between the competencies of nurses from government hospitals and private hospitals. So that is the two types of hypothesis. The alternative hypothesis is the one that refutes or contradicts the null hypothesis, right? So this contradiction refers to the fact that sample mean is greater than, less than, or not equal to from that established in the null hypothesis. That is, the alternative hypothesis can be directional or non-directional hypothesis. So, pwedeng yung alternative natin ay directional or non-directional. So, as you can see here, we have a sample, a figure here wherein we have the bell shape, wherein this side, both sides are shaded, and this one shade lang yung na the other side is shaded but yung sa kabila hindi. So, saan kaya dito ang directional and non-directional hypothesis? So, let's see. So, directional and non-directional hypothesis, let's have first a directional test of hypothesis. So, the hypothesis is directional when the alternative hypothesis defines an orientation either greater than or less than that established in the null hypothesis. So, we can say that it is directional if it stated greater than or less than. Okay? So, it is considered if the direction of the difference is stated. So, na-state yung direction niya. So, that is the self-concept of one group is more positive than that of the other group. The hypothesis is in its alternative form. So, this test makes use of one-tailed test or one-sided test. So, the second figure a while back is the directional test, wherein it is a one-tailed test. Okay? Isang part lang yung na-shaded. So, it specifies existence and relationships. For example, we have the null hypothesis, all adults sleep 7 hours a day. The alternative hypothesis, which is a directional test of hypothesis, can be all adults sleep more than 7 hours a day or all adults sleep less than 7 hours a day. Okay? That is a directional test or the one-sided, one-tailed test. While the other one, so on the other hand, the hypothesis is non-directional when the alternative hypothesis does not define an orientation explicitly. That is, it only determines that the hypothesis class is different from the null hypothesis. Okay? It only determines that the hypothesis is different from the null hypothesis. So, hindi naka-state yung direction niya. So, it makes use of two-tailed test. So, the left figure a while back is the non-directional, yung dalawang, both sides, some part of the both sides are shaded. So, that is a two-tailed test or the non-directional test. So, the test is considered non-directional if the direction or the nature of the difference is not stated. So, hindi siya naka-state. It only predicts the existence. Okay? It only predicts the existence. That is the non-directional. So, for example, the null hypothesis, all adults sleep 7 hours a day. The alternative, which is non-directional, all adults do not sleep 7 hours a day. So, a while back, the directional test it is for its alternative hypothesis, it stated there that all adults sleep more than 7 hours or less than 7 hours. That is directional. While for non-directional, all adults do not sleep, okay, do not sleep 7 hours a day, which means it can be either more than or less than. So the direction is not stated, which is a two-tailed test. Okay. So in here, so this one is the two-tailed test or the non-directional, and this one is the one-tailed test or the directional. As you can see, so the level of significance here is 5%. So 5% in here, 95% yan. Ito, 2.5, 2.5. Bakit 2.5, 2.5? Kasi hinati into 2. Kasi two-tailed test siya. So 5% divided by 2, that is 2.5%. So, yun yung pagkakaiba ng directional and non-directional hypothesis when it comes to alternative hypothesis. Now let's have the type 1 and type 2 error. So there are type 1 and type 2 error when we talk about the hypothesis class. So the type 1 error is that when the null hypothesis is true and you reject it, you make a type 1 error. Okay? So kapag na-prove natin or nakuha natin that the null hypothesis, our HO is true, pero ni-reject natin, we make a type 1 error. So the probability of making a type 1 error is alpha, okay, which is the level of significance you set for your hypothesis test. An alpha of 0.05, so the alpha is 0.05 level of significance, indicates that you are willing to accept a 5% chance that you are wrong when you reject the null hypothesis. So to lower this risk, you must use a lower value for alpha. So however, using a lower value for alpha means that you will be less likely to detect a true difference if one really exists. So, which means class no hypothesis, we sometimes we commit type 1 and type 2 error, which means no hypothesis test is 100% certain. So, because the test is based on probabilities, so there is always a chance of making an incorrect conclusion. So, when you do a hypothesis test, two types of errors are possible, which is the type 1 and type 2 error. So the risk of these two errors are inversely related and determined by the level of significance and the power for the test. So therefore, you should determine which error has more severe consequences for your situation before you define their risk. Okay, nakadepende sa level of significance natin. So, type 1, if you reject the null hypothesis when it is true, you commit the type 1 error. While the other one, the type 2 error is when the null hypothesis is false and you fail to reject it. You make a type 2 error. So, the null hypothesis is false, tapos nag-fail ka na i-reject, which means inaccept mo yung null when it is false. So, you commit a type 2 error. So, the probability of making a type 2 error is the beta. So, which depends on the power of the test. Okay. Kung kanina type 1 error is the level of significance, the type 2 error depends on the power of the test. You can decrease your risk of committing a type 2 error by ensuring your test has enough power. So you can do this by ensuring your sample size is large enough to detect a practical difference when one truly exists. Okay? So, let's have yan. So, we have a table in here. So, the table explains the two types of error committed by a researcher when making a decision. So, when you reject the null hypothesis when it is true, it is known as the type 1 error. Ayan. You reject the null hypothesis pero true siya, you commit the type 1 error. While when you fail to accept or you accept the null hypothesis when it is false, so it is the type 2 error. Fail to reject HO when it is false, which means you accept the null hypothesis. So that is the type 2 error. For example, so medical researcher wants to compare the effectiveness of two medications, the null and alternative hypothesis. Let me just correct this one. Not. The null and alternative hypotheses are, so null means, which means neutral lang tayo. So the two medications are equally effective. So in symbol, so we use this symbol. So mu sub 1 is equal to mu sub 2. Our first medicine is equal to our second medicine. So parehas silang effective. For the alternative, our HA is equal to our first medicine is not equal to our second medicine, which means either the first medicine is effective than that of the second medicine, or the second medicine is effective than that of the first medicine. So, as you can see, our alternative here is non-directional hypothesis test. Non-directional test of hypothesis. So, walang direction yung alternative natin. Kaya, two-tailed test siya. So, the two medications are not equally effective. So, yun yung alternative natin. So, kung mapapansin nyo dito, so this is yung symbol, not equal. So, a type 1 error occurs if the researcher rejects the null hypothesis and concludes that the two medications are different when in fact they are not. Okay? So, we commit a type 1 error if the researcher ni-reject niya yung null hypothesis natin at kinongclude niya that the two medication are different. Well, in fact, they are not. So, if the medications have the same effectiveness, the researcher may not consider this error too severe because the patients still benefit from the same level of effectiveness regardless of which medicine they take. Okay, di ba? Ang type 1 error natin is that when we reject the null hypothesis when it is true. Ni-reject natin yung null when it is true. Okay? So, we commit that type 1 error. However, if a type 2 error occurs, the researcher fails to reject the null hypothesis when it should be rejected. So, that is the researcher concludes that the medication are the same when in fact they are different. So, nakakommit siya ng type 2 error doon. So, this error is potentially life-threatening with the less effective medication is sold to the public instead of the more effective one. So, parang mahirap kapag we commit a type 2 error. So, as you conduct your hypothesis test class, consider the risk of making type 1 and type 2 error. So, if the consequences of making a type of error are more severe or costly than making the other type of error, then choose a level of significance and a power for the test that will reflect the relative severity of these consequences. So, dito parang this situation, medyo mahirap na mag-commit tayo doon sa type 2 error. Okay, wherein ang type 2 error is the null accepting the null hypothesis when it is false. So, na-accept natin na that the two medications are equally effective when it is not. Okay. So, that is the type 1 and type 2 error. So that ends our discussion for today. Thank you for watching. If you have some question, just comment on the chat box. Just ask your question about the topic today. So goodbye and God bless everyone. Bye.